pre-dawn darkness of May 1st. 1898 hung heavy over Manila Bay like a funeral shroud, broken only by the distant glow of oil lamps flickering aboard the Spanish squadron anchored near Cavite. Admiral Patricio Montoyo, y Pasaron, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Reina Cristina, watching the horizon with the grim certainty of a man who knew he was about to witness the end of an empire. 3 centuries of Spanish dominion in the Pacific was about to be decided in a matter of hours, though Montoyo could scarcely have imagined the swiftness of the approaching catastrophe. His 7 warships, a motley collection of aging cruisers and gunboats, represented the fading glory of what had once been the world's most formidable naval power. The Reina Cristina, his pride and joy, was a steel-hulled cruiser of 3,400 tons, armed with 6-inch guns that had seen better days. Alongside her floated the Castilla, an ancient wooden vessel that seemed more suited to a maritime museum than a modern naval battle. The Spanish admiral had positioned his fleet in the shallow waters near Cavite Arsenal, hoping that the shoals would provide some protection and that his shore batteries might supplement his meager firepower. It was a defensive strategy born of desperation rather than tactical brilliance. Montoyo knew that somewhere beyond the darkness, Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic squadron was approaching with overwhelming force and modern American steel, as reported in contemporary accounts from the Manila Times. The tension among the Spanish crews was palpable that morning. Many of the sailors had families living in nearby Cavite, and the knowledge that they were about to face a technologically superior enemy weighed heavily on their minds. The wooden-hulled Castilla, in particular, seemed woefully inadequate for what was to come, her ancient timbers no match for modern explosive shells. The irony was not lost on Montoyo that Spain, the nation that had once dominated the world's oceans with its treasure fleets and galleons, now found itself desperately outgunned in waters it had controlled since the conquest of the Philippines in the 16th century. The empire that had brought Christianity and Spanish culture to these distant islands was about to lose them in a single morning's work to a nation that had been a collection of rebellious colonies just over a century before. At precisely 4:45 in the morning, a lookout's cry shattered the humid silence. Ack! Ships approaching from the north. The dark silhouettes of Dewey's squadron emerged from the gloom like maritime phantoms, their smokestacks already belching the black coal smoke that would soon darken the tropical sky. The USS Olympia led the column, her white-painted hull gleaming in the first light of dawn, followed by the Baltimore, Raleigh, Petrel, Concord, and Boston. Montoyo crossed himself and gave the order to prepare for battle, knowing full well that he was about to preside over the death throes of Spanish naval power in the Pacific, the day that would make George Dewey a household name across America was about to begin. Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of the USS Olympia, his weathered face set in grim determination as his squadron approached the Spanish line. 59 years of age, the Vermont-born naval officer had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. Though he could hardly have imagined that the fate of an empire would rest on the next few hours of naval combat, the American squadron moved in perfect formation through the pre-dawn darkness, their engines synchronized in a deadly ballet of modern naval warfare. Dewey had planned this attack meticulously during the long voyage from Hong Kong, where he had received the fateful cable from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, ordering him to proceed to the Philippines and engage the Spanish fleet. The message had been characteristically blunt. In the event of declaration of war, Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic station, and then offensive operations in Philippine Islands. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the humid air over Manila Bay, Dewey could see the Spanish ships clearly for the first time. They appeared pitiful compared to his own modern steel warships, but he knew better than to underestimate any enemy. The Olympia, his flagship, was a first-class protected cruiser of 5,700 tons, armed with 4 8-inch guns and 10 5-inch guns. Behind her came the Baltimore, nearly as powerful, and the smaller but deadly Raleigh, Petrel, Concord, and Boston. At 5:15 in the morning, the Spanish shore batteries at Cavite opened fire, their shells splashing harmlessly into the water. Several hundred yards short of the American line, Dewey ordered his squadron to close the range, steaming directly toward the enemy in a bold display of naval confidence that would become legendary. The Spanish ships, anchored in a crescent formation near Cavite, began firing their main guns. But their gunnery was wild and ineffective in the growing excitement of battle, according to detailed accounts. It's preserved in the Naval War College archives. Dewey's tactical approach was masterful in its simplicity. Rather than engaging in a long-range artillery duel, he chose to close two decisive range where his superior gunnery training and modern equipment would tell. At 5:40 in the morning, when the range had closed to 5,500 yards, Dewey turned to his flag captain, Charles Vernon Gridley, and spoke the words that would echo through American naval history. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The Olympia's forward 8-inch gun roared to life, sending its massive shell screaming across the water toward the Spanish flagship. Within moments, the entire American line was in action, their guns firing in deliberate, measured salvos that contrasted sharply with the frantic and largely ineffective Spanish response. The superior training of American gunners, honed through years of practice with modern fire control systems, became immediately apparent. The Spanish fleet, caught at anchor and unable to maneuver effectively, found itself trapped in a deadly crossfire as Dewey led his squadron in a series of passing attacks. The Reina Cristina, Admiral Montoyo's flagship, bore the brunt of the American fire, her superstructure torn apart by a devastating sequence of hits. Within the first hour of combat, it became clear that this would not be a battle, but a methodical destruction of Spanish naval power in the Pacific. The thunderous roar of naval artillery shattered the morning calm as the USS Olympia's guns found their mark on the Spanish flagship. Admiral Montoyo watched in horror as American shells tore through the Reina Cristina's superstructure, sending deadly splinters of steel flying across her deck like lethal rain. The contrast between the disciplined American gunnery and the increasingly desperate Spanish response became more pronounced with each passing minute. Captain Luis Cadarso, commanding the Reina Cristina under Montoyo's flag, proved himself a hero in these desperate moments. Despite the overwhelming firepower directed at his ship, he attempted to close the range and ram the Olympia in a final suicidal gesture of defiance. It was an act of magnificent courage born of desperation, the kind of romantic naval gesture that belonged to an earlier age of wooden ships and iron men. The Reina Cristina began to move forward under full steam, her engines straining to build speed despite the devastating hits she was absorbing, but modern naval warfare had no place for such heroic gestures. The American gunners, trained to mathematical precision, poured a devastating fire into the advancing Spanish cruiser. Shell after shell crashed into her hull and superstructure, starting fires that began to spread unchecked through her wooden fittings. Captain Cadarso fell mortally wounded on his bridge, struck down by flying metal as he tried to con his ship into ramming position. The death of Captain Cadarso marked the effective end of Spanish resistance in Manila Bay, though the fighting would continue for several more hours. As documented in contemporary Spanish naval records, the loss of this gallant officer symbolized the larger tragedy unfolding across the bay. The Reina Cristina, her steering gear shot away and her engines failing, began to drift helplessly as fires raged through her hull. Admiral Montoyo, recognizing that his flagship was doomed, ordered her abandoned and transferred his flag to the smaller cruiser Isla de Cuba. The scene aboard the burning Spanish flagship was one of barely controlled chaos. Spanish sailors, many of them wounded, struggled to launch boats and abandon ship as American shells continued to find their target. The Reina Cristina's magazines were in danger of exploding, threatening to take hundreds of men down with her. In one of the most poignant moments of the battle, Spanish officers could be seen helping wounded sailors into the few remaining boats while the ship's band continued playing the Spanish national anthem from the quarterdeck. Commodore Dewey, observing the destruction through his binoculars, later wrote that he felt a mixture of professional satisfaction and human sympathy as he watched the brave Spanish sailors struggling to save their comrades. This was modern warfare at its most efficient and devastating, where technological superiority could render courage and determination almost irrelevant. The age of naval romanticism was ending in the smoke and flame of Manila Bay. By 7 in the morning, the Reina Cristina was a floating wreck, her guns silenced, and her hull settling by the bow. The Spanish flagship that had once been the pride of their Pacific squadron was now nothing more than a burning hulk, soon to slip beneath the tropical waters of Manila Bay. Her destruction marked not just the loss of a single warship, but the symbolic end of 3 centuries of Spanish naval dominance in the Pacific Ocean. At 7:30 in the morning, with the Spanish flagship burning and listing heavily to port, Commodore Dewey made one of the most audacious decisions in naval history. In the midst of what appeared to be a desperate battle, he ordered his squadron to withdraw to the center of Manila Bay for what he calmly announced as a breakfast break. To the Spanish defenders watching from their battered ships and shore positions, it must have seemed like an act of supreme American confidence bordering on arrogance. The truth behind Dewey's decision was more prosaic but no less tactically sound. His ships had been firing steadily for over 2 hours, and their magazines were beginning to run low on ammunition. And more importantly, he wanted to assess the damage to his own squadron and determine the most effective way to complete the destruction of the remaining Spanish ships. But perhaps most significantly, he had received reports that his ships were running dangerously low on the coal needed to maintain steam pressure in their boilers. As the American squadron steamed slowly away from the Spanish line, the silence that fell over Manila Bay was almost more unnerving than the thunderous artillery duel that had preceded it. Spanish sailors aboard the surviving ships watched in amazement as the Americans calmly dropped anchor and began serving breakfast to their crews, as if they had just completed a routine gunnery exercise rather than a major naval battle. Lieutenant Carlos Gilberto Calkins, serving aboard the USS Baltimore, later wrote in his diary that the breakfast served that morning was among the most surreal meals of his naval career. While Spanish shells had been falling around them just minutes before, American sailors now calmly consumed coffee, hardtack, and salt pork while their officers studied charts and planned the next phase of their attack. The contrast could not have been more stark between the disciplined professionalism of the American fleet and the increasingly desperate situation of their Spanish opponents. During this interlude, Dewey received his first accurate casualty reports from his ship captains. The news was almost unbelievably good. Not a single American sailor had been killed, and only a handful had been wounded. The Spanish gunnery, while enthusiastic, had proven woefully inaccurate. Most of their shells had fallen short or passed harmlessly overhead, testament to the poor training and obsolete equipment that plagued the Spanish Navy in its declining years. The psychological effect of Dewey's breakfast break on Spanish morale cannot be overstated. As reported in subsequent interviews with Spanish survivors, the sight of American sailors calmly eating their morning meal while Spanish ships burned in the distance created a sense of hopeless inevitability among the defenders. It was a demonstration of American confidence that spoke more eloquently than any amount of gunfire about the ultimate outcome of this battle. Admiral Montoyo used this lull to transfer his flag from the damaged islet of Cuba to the shore batteries at Cavite, effectively conceding that his fleet was no longer capable of meaningful resistance. The Spanish commander had lost his flagship, his best captain. In any hope of preventing American control of Manila Bay, all that remained was to salvage what honor he could from an impossible situation. At 10:40 in the morning, having completed their leisurely breakfast and ammunition resupply, the American squadron weighed anchor and prepared to resume the battle. The Spanish ships that remained afloat watched their approach with the grim knowledge that they were about to witness the final act in the destruction of Spanish naval power in the Pacific. The resumption of the American attack at 11 in the morning marked the beginning of the end for Spanish resistance in Manila Bay. Commodore Dewey had used his breakfast interlude not just to rest his crews and replenish ammunition, but to develop a more systematic approach to the destruction of the remaining Spanish vessels. What followed was less a battle than a methodical execution carried out with the precision of a naval exercise. The Spanish fleet, what remained of it, presented a sorry sight as the American squadron approached for the final time. The Reina Cristina was now completely ablaze and beginning to settle by the bow, her proud silhouette transformed into a twisted wreck of burning steel and wood. The ancient Castilla, her wooden hull no match for modern explosive shells, was listing heavily and taking on water through dozens of holes torn in her sides by American gunfire. Captain Joaquin Elisa, commanding the Spanish gunboat Isla de Luzon, made one final attempt at resistance as the American ships closed range. His small vessel, mounting only a few light guns, steamed directly toward the USS Petrel in a hopeless but gallant effort to inflict some damage on the enemy. It was the kind of heroic but futile gesture that characterized Spanish naval tactics throughout this disastrous morning. Courage without the technological means to make it effective. The Petrel's response was swift and devastating. Her 5-inch guns, firing at point-blank range, literally tore the Spanish gunboat apart. Within minutes, the Isla de Luzon was a sinking wreck. Her captain dead, and her crew swimming for their lives in the oil-slicked waters of Manila Bay. The destruction was so complete and so rapid that American sailors aboard the Petrel were shocked by their own deadly efficiency. Meanwhile, the shore batteries at Cavite continued their ineffective fire, their obsolete guns unable to reach the American ships or inflict any meaningful damage. Spanish artillery officers, trained on weapons that belonged to an earlier generation of naval warfare, found themselves completely outclassed by American naval gunnery that represented the cutting edge of late 19th century military technology. Their shells fell harmlessly into the water, while American return fire systematically destroyed gun after gun along the Spanish defensive line. As documented in the official Spanish naval history compiled after the war, the final phase of the battle resembled a target practice more than a naval engagement between two modern fleets. American gunners, now thoroughly warmed up and with their range perfectly established, placed their shots with mathematical precision. Every Spanish ship still afloat was methodically destroyed, their wooden hulls splintered and their iron fittings twisted into unrecognizable shapes by the devastating impact of American artillery. The Mindanao, another Spanish gunboat, attempted to escape by running aground near the shore, but American shells followed her even into the shallows. The Don Juan de Austria, perhaps the most modern ship in the Spanish squadron after the lost Reina Cristina, fought gamely until her ammunition was exhausted and her guns silenced. One by one, the ships that had represented Spanish naval power in the Pacific were reduced to burning wrecks or sent to the bottom of Manila Bay. By noon on May 1st, 1898, the destruction was complete. Every Spanish warship was either sunk, burning, or run aground and abandoned. The shore batteries had been silenced, their guns dismounted, and their crews fled. In approximately 7 hours of combat, the United States Navy had effectively ended 3 centuries of Spanish naval dominance in the Pacific Ocean. The age of American naval power in the Far East had begun with devastating efficiency. As the smoke of battle began to clear over Manila Bay at midday on May 1st, 1898, the magnitude of the American victory became starkly apparent. Where the Spanish Pacific Squadron had anchored that morning in proud formation, now only burning wrecks and oil slicks marked their final resting places. The USS Olympia and her consorts steamed slowly through the debris field, their crews marveling at the completeness of their triumph. The casualty figures, when finally tallied, would shock the world with their stark imbalance. The Spanish fleet had suffered catastrophic losses, over 400 men killed or wounded. With Captain Luis Cadarso among the dead heroes who had fought hopeless odds with magnificent courage, every Spanish warship had been either sunk, burned, beyond repair, or run aground as unseaworthy hulks. The shore batteries at Cavite Arsenal lay in ruins, their guns twisted into scrap metal by accurate American bombardment. In contrast, American casualties were so light as to seem almost miraculous. Not a single American sailor had been killed in the entire engagement, and only 8 men had been wounded. most of them by flying splinters from near misses, rather than direct hits. The USS Olympia had suffered minor damage to her paint and rigging, while the Baltimore reported a few dents in her armor plating. It was a victory so complete and so one-sided that it would reshape American perceptions of their nation's place in the world. Commodore Dewey immediately dispatched his revenue cutter, Hugh McCulloch, to Manila with a message for the Spanish Governor-General, demanding the surrender of the city and its naval facilities. The message was characteristically direct. American forces now controlled Manila Bay absolutely, and any attempt to resist further would be futile. The Spanish colonial government, cut off from reinforcement and supply by the destruction of their fleet, found themselves in an impossible position. The international implications of Dewey's victory became apparent within hours of the battle's end. According to contemporary newspaper reports from the Hong Kong Telegraph, news of the Spanish defeat sent shockwaves through European capitals where the balance of power in the Pacific was suddenly and dramatically altered. Germany, which had been eyeing potential naval bases in the Philippines, now found American warships firmly established in waters they had hoped to dominate. Britain, America's potential rival in the Far East, suddenly saw the United States as a serious naval power. That could no longer be dismissed. Spanish survivors, pulled from the water by American boats in a display of humanitarian concern that contrasted sharply with the devastating efficiency of the battle itself, told stories of technological overwhelm that would become typical of modern warfare. Many spoke of the terrifying accuracy of American gunnery, the way their ships had been systematically destroyed by enemies they could barely see through the smoke of battle. The age of naval combat, where courage and seamanship could overcome technological disadvantage, was clearly ending in the wreckage of Manila Bay. Admiral Montoyo, who had watched his fleet's destruction from the shore batteries at Cavite, began the painful process of composing his report to Madrid in measured language that could not disguise the magnitude of the disaster. He would describe how Spanish naval power in the Pacific had been annihilated in a single morning by an enemy force that had suffered virtually no losses in return. The report would mark the effective end of Spain's status as a global naval power, or a position the nation had held since the days of Columbus and Cortez. The sun set on May 1st, 1898, over a transformed Manila Bay, where American warships now rode at anchor in waters that had been Spanish for over 3 centuries. Commodore George Dewey, standing on the quarterdeck of the USS Olympia, surveyed a scene that marked not just a tactical victory, but a fundamental shift in global power that would echo through the 20th century and beyond. Within hours of the battle's end, news of Dewey's triumph had reached the United States via underwater cable, electrifying a nation that had entered the Spanish-American War with uncertain goals and limited expectations. President William McKinley, who had reportedly needed to consult an atlas to locate the Philippines just weeks before, now found himself in possession of a strategic foothold in the Far East that would make America a Pacific power rivaling Britain. In Germany, the political ramifications in Washington were immediate and profound. Theodore Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy who had ordered Dewey to the Philippines, saw his prescient decision vindicated in the most spectacular fashion possible. The victory at Manila Bay became a cornerstone of Roosevelt's political career and his vision of America as a global naval power. Congress, which had been debating the wisdom of overseas expansion, suddenly found public opinion demanding that the Philippines be retained as an American territory for Spain. The destruction of the Pacific Squadron represented far more than a military defeat. It marked the final collapse of an empire that had once spanned the globe. The Spanish government were already struggling with rebellion in Cuba and facing American naval power in the Caribbean, now confronted the loss of their most distant and profitable colony. The treasure fleets that had once carried silver from Mexico to Manila, connecting Spanish dominions across 2 oceans, would never sail again under the Spanish flag. The Filipino people, who had been fighting their own war of independence against Spanish rule under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, suddenly found themselves with new potential masters rather than the freedom they had been seeking. The American victory that had seemed like liberation would soon prove to be the beginning of another colonial relationship. one that would lead to years of conflict between American forces and Filipino independence fighters, as documented in contemporary European diplomatic correspondence. The international community recognized immediately that Dewey's victory represented a seismic shift in Pacific geopolitics. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had been planning his own expansion into the Pacific, now faced an established American presence that could not be dislodged. Japan, just beginning its own rise as a naval power, took careful note of American capabilities and began planning accordingly for a future that might bring the two nations into conflict. Commodore Dewey himself, transformed overnight from an obscure naval officer into a national hero, would find his life forever changed by those few hours of combat in Manila Bay. Congress would promote him to Admiral of the Navy, a rank created specifically for him, and grateful Americans would name streets, parks, and children in his honor. The phrase "you may fire when ready" Gridley would enter the American lexicon as a symbol of quiet confidence and decisive action. The Battle of Manila Bay had lasted less than 7 hours, but its consequences would shape American foreign policy for generations. In those few hours of devastating naval gunfire, the United States had announced its arrival as a global power, while Spain had witnessed the final sunset of its once mighty empire. The age of American influence in the Pacific had begun with the thunder of the Olympia's guns, and the world would never be quite the same again.